Firstly, I think the question so many people are still asking, how could this happen?
That's a great question. I don't know that we have the complete answer to that yet. I think one of the most disturbing things that comes from this experience is that Crooks, the shooter, has now shown the world how easy it is to do this under the right circumstances. There's a perceived vulnerability. Taking advantage of that vulnerability makes a horrific act of political violence entirely possible.
Who is ultimately responsible for the safety of a political candidate at an event like that?
Sure. So that in this country, that's the Secret Service. That is their job, to ensure the safety of the protectee, as they refer to whoever it is they're protecting. In this case, of course, the former President Donald Trump.
And we're not talking just on the day. I mean, before a public event or a rally like that, the Secret Service would have advanced teams, a security plan in place?
As soon as they know that a rally of this type or an event, any event really, has been scheduled by the campaign, an advance team begins working on it. They begin preparing their plans, doing their research. They travel out to the location. One of the most important things they do on those trips is meeting with local law enforcement, who they will have to rely on. No matter where they are and what's happening there, they must rely on the assistance and support of local law enforcement. So that takes some really solid liaison work, opening up those lines of communication, making it clear what they need from their partners on the ground, and who has which roles. All those sorts of things come within the scope of the advance team.
So when we think about the role and responsibility of local law enforcement, that really comes down to what the Secret Service has asked of them.
Exactly. So each site is different, each event is different. The exposure of the protectee will be different at every event. So those things are constantly shifting. And so it's absolutely within the responsibility of the Secret Service to inform local law enforcement and their kind of ad hoc task force of partners at that event, what's going to be happening, and more critically, what they need of those partners.
What is the most basic element of securing an outdoor site like this?
Outdoor sites are infinitely more complicated than indoor sites for obvious reasons, but the most basic thing is to ensure that uncleared people who haven't gone through magnetometers, who haven't been subjected to some security searches, looking in their bags or articles, you want to make sure uncleared people are not within that perimeter or anywhere around the area where they could present a threat to the protectee.
Explain the line of sight clearance. What does that mean? How critical is it?
Sure. So when you think about the many different types of threats that someone could pose to the protectee, you consider first that person, that threat, getting close within a hand's reach, let's say, of the protectee, and then everything out from there. And the furthest away threat that someone could pose to a protectee is taking a long-distance shot, rifle shot at that person. And so to understand where the vulnerabilities might be in your sight for those kinds of long-distance rifle shots, you have to understand line of sight. So any place, even if it seems far away, if it gives the shooter the advantage of height and a clear, uninterrupted, direct line of sight to the protectee, then that's someplace that someone could use to take a long-distance shot at the protectee.
Like the rooftop?
Exactly like the rooftop.
So is that just a complete miss, a failure of the advance team?
It certainly seems to be. Now, I say this with the caveat that the Secret Service is investigating their own performance on that day. Congress is conducting its own oversight investigation. So we'll learn more about what decisions were made, or maybe what decisions weren't made, and how this vulnerability was allowed to persist.
But on the face of it, is there any reason you can think of why that basic step of line of sight wasn't picked up?
To me, it's inconceivable. There are many good questions about why were those buildings not included within the security perimeter. But either way, there's a very obvious line of sight from that building, from the exact spot that the shooter took to the stage where the former president would be speaking.
Members of the local SWAT team spotted Crooks and actually radioed in to command.
They did.
Within an hour, less than an hour before he opened fire.
So he was spotted by local law enforcement, again, outside the security perimeter, but nevertheless on the site. He was reported to look suspicious and be conducting himself in a suspicious way. He was seen to be using a rangefinder, which, in my opinion, you could make a very solid argument that raises you from suspicious to threatening. What's the purpose of a rangefinder at an event like that? There seems to be only one very clear purpose, which is a danger to the protectee. He was seen at first an hour or so before, and then several times during that hour in different places, but was never, approached and interviewed and questioned in any way.
So is that just a breakdown in communications between the local team and the Secret Service?
It certainly seems to be. We now know that across that series of spottings of him and those radio messages and also text messages between members of the local law enforcement team, that he was a person of concern for them. For whatever reason, they didn't have someone with persistent, have him under persistent surveillance. He was in and out of the crowd. They were probably losing sight of him periodically, and then he would reemerge. But it's not clear that there was any involvement or notification to the Secret Service of those several sightings. Again, we might learn that at the conclusion of these investigations, but so far we don't know that.
It's astounding to me that Donald Trump was allowed to walk on stage.
It's even with just a persistently suspicious person having been identified in the crowd, doing something as odd as using a rangefinder, it raises the very serious question about why they didn't delay the protectee, Donald Trump's appearance on stage, until they had positively located and cleared that person.
What role does the FBI play on the ground at a rally like that?
It might surprise some of your viewers, but not a big role on the ground on the day of the event. What the FBI does is it feeds its intelligence and its understanding about the threat picture to the Secret Service in the lead up to the event. So most of the FBI's role is in helping the Secret Service to prepare that advance team to understand what threats might be they might encounter on the day of the event. But at the event on the ground, not typically a big official FBI presence.
So on that, there had been some intelligence that Iran was plotting to kill the former president.
That's right.
In the lead up to the rally. Was that a credible, well-known threat to your knowledge?
It certainly seems to have been. The FBI has been pretty clear about the fact that they passed that threat information on to the Secret Service, and the service used that information to rethink their security to some extent for this event. We know that they had not been deploying counter-sniper teams with the former president as he traveled about to his political rallies, but they added those teams to this event. There were 2 Secret Service counter-sniper teams deployed at the event, and there were an additional 2 counter-sniper teams from the local law enforcement agencies as well.
To your mind, with the knowledge of the Iran threat, I mean, doesn't that make the security failure even more shocking?
It certainly does. It certainly does. So a security failure along the lines that we saw in Butler, Pennsylvania, is only more kind of astounding in light of the fact that in the lead up to that event, you had a heightened threat communicated to you from an intelligence partner, in this case the FBI.
With everything that you've heard so far from the hearings, how would you describe what happened in Butler?
It's really hard, I think, to kind of to sum it up in one word. There's so many aspects to this. There are all kinds of persistent questions that we don't have answers to yet about resource allocation, about what sort of decisions they were making in the lead up to the event. The decision to define the security perimeter in a way that did not include those rooftops that were ultimately used as the shooting position. Was that an active decision? Did someone decide that that did not present a particular threat, or was it just an inadvertent omission? Both of those seem almost unbelievable to me, but there's so many. I think what we'll find is there's not one thing, not one mistake or one cause to this failure, but probably many that cumulatively put the service in a very bad position.
And either way, it's, as has been acknowledged in the hearings, it was a monumental failure.
Absolutely. When your job is to protect the former president of the United States and you take responsibility for protecting him at that event, and someone tries to kill him at that event and almost does, that's a failure on any grounds.
I read a poll that less than a third of Americans have faith that the Secret Service can protect presidential candidates from political violence in the lead up to the election. That's pretty concerning.
It's really concerning. It's unfortunate. I also think it's a little bit unfair to the service, to be perfectly honest, because they do this hard work every day. They have to be right and perfect all the time, and most of the time they are. But we do know that over the course of their history, there have been numerous attempts on the lives of protectees, of presidents. They take each one of those instances and learn from it and adjust their policies going forward. But certainly the events at Butler are the sort that really shake the public confidence in this incredibly important agency and the singular mission they have.
And quite triggering, I imagine, and reminiscent of an era of American politics that no one wants to return to.
No question. You know, a lot of the conversations around political violence, and this is an example, a very recent and horrible example of political violence. I think many Americans reflexively think like, this is not who we are. But in fact, if you look at our history, it is who we are. We are a country that has had significant experiences with political violence in our past. Fortunately, those have not been recent. Well, not too many recently, but this is something that we have to always keep an eye on and always protect against because it's out there, it's a possibility, and many would argue, I would argue, a more likely possibility today than it was maybe even 10 years ago.
The current Deputy Director of the FBI has been criticised for not being transparent enough about the Bureau's probe into the assassination attempt. How difficult is it for the FBI in these early phases of an investigation like this?
Very, very tough. It's, well, first, this is the kind of work that the FBI does incredibly well. There isn't another law enforcement agency on earth that is quite as well prepared and experienced at conducting very large, complicated, in this case, forensic examinations, investigations of crime scenes very quickly and using their skills and tools and science to understand what happened. So I'm sure they are doing those things in the way that they always do. But they are doing it against the background of a public, an entire nation that is screaming for results and information. You know, typically FBI investigations are not discussed publicly. However, even the FBI's own rules acknowledge exceptions to that policy when it's necessary to inform the public about existing threats or the potential for existing threats. We seem to be firmly within one of those exceptions right now, so it's I think it would be good for them to be as transparent as they can possibly be.
And also I think when what the public sees is, I mean, anyone can watch, there's hours of that SWAT team, the local law enforcement body camera vision.
Sure.
What's very clear from that body cam is it was complete chaos and confusion. None of them knew who was where, who was covering the factory, the rooftop, if anyone was, where the shooter was, if he was dead or alive. I mean, it's pretty scary to watch.
It is. It is, and I think particularly for people who aren't involved, who aren't first responders, who aren't law enforcement people, seeing that sort of kind of intensity and chaos is shocking. But that's the reality of critical incidents. People's adrenaline and communication is kind of ramped up to 110%, right? And there are those moments of chaos where you are struggling to develop an accurate understanding of what's happening around you and to react to that understanding quickly enough to dispatch a threat. But so it's I think an important insight for people to see those videos, but it's not a comforting one.
And it doesn't paint the whole picture.
It certainly doesn't, no.
So what would the Bureau be focusing on right now in this investigation?
So today the Bureau is focusing on the immediate investigation involves preserving the crime scene and collecting the evidence. And then, of course, if you think about it in kind of concentric circles, beyond the crime scene, you have the evidence collected from the shooter's home and from his electronics devices and all those sorts of things, because you really want to understand with as granular vision as possible everything that led the shooter to that moment. You know, we know who did this. There's not going to be a prosecution. He's, of course, no longer alive. But we still need to know, to be able to understand the threat picture we are dealing with, how did this person go from smart, science-inclined high school student to attempting to kill a former president of the United States? And that's what the Bureau is looking into right now. What they discover in the course of that investigation could forever change the way Americans think about political violence and what political people will do to advance their own agendas. So far, it looks like Crooks was not a very political person, which is, I think, not an outcome that anyone expected, but that seems to be what we're learning from what the FBI has disclosed so far.
There are always, I mean, you were in the FBI for a long time, you would have heard a lot of conspiracy theories. What do you make of the theories coming from even the family of the victim, who say this was, you know, all a setup and law enforcement wasn't supposed to intervene? And I mean, you would have heard all this stuff for decades.
Yeah, I mean, I give no credit whatsoever to those conspiracy theories. If anything, the public has become more obsessed with conspiracy theories in the last 10 to 20 years. I started my career in the FBI right in the immediate aftermath of the TWA Flight 800 disaster, and saw firsthand. Even then, in the old days before social media and everything else, there were a raft of really damaging conspiracy theories about the government and their, supposed government conspiracies about shooting down the plane and all this other abject nonsense. Those things are, the FBI doesn't get bogged down in those things. We stay focused on the facts and the law. But those conspiracy theories are really harmful, I think, to the general public's understanding of what actually happened, and particularly to the victims of those crimes. So I think that it's unfortunate that people are so willing to kind of give oxygen to that misinformation, but that's a part of the world we live in.
We're talking about Donald Trump. I mean, this is one of the most high-profile and most divisive political candidates in history.
Sure.
So whilst it's concerning, it's probably not surprising.
I don't think it's surprising at all. We give birth to conspiracy theories every day, many of them about Donald Trump or involving Donald Trump. And so this ground is very fertile. But nevertheless, people would be much better served if we just pressed our government representatives, pressed the FBI for facts, for transparency, and then considered that information as we try to make decisions about what we think happened.
We've seen already the director of the Secret Service resign over this. Should more heads roll?
I think from my perspective, knowing what we know now, it's not obvious to me that there is a particular agency head or official who should be removed as a result of what happened here. But, as we've said, the jury's still out, right? There's a lot of investigation to be done. There's a lot of reporting back to the public to be done. And so we'll see when that process is finished. We'll see if there were folks who either made decisions poorly or neglected to make decisions that they should have, and how that falls out for them.
It's probably no surprise either that this happened. I mean, we may not always hear about these attempts because they don't come to fruition.
Yeah.
But, I mean, how many threats from Iran to domestic threats would come to the attention of the FBI of this nature that the public doesn't even hear about?
I mean, it's a tidal wave, particularly now. If you just look at the numbers of threats and the demand for protective resources that the U.S. Capitol Police is operating under now, it's leagues beyond where they were 10 years ago. So the number of threats against public figures, political figures, I mean, from obviously the former president down to local county election officials across the entire country, it's off the charts. So, and that's not just a burden on the FBI, it's a burden on every agency that's responsible for protecting those people, from the Bureau to the Capitol Police, Secret Service, local police, sheriff's departments in counties around the country. They are struggling to understand how serious are these threats and what must we do to protect people and what can we do legally and with limited resources to protect folks.
With not long to go now until the election, how critical is it that the FBI understands or gets to the bottom of this investigation, understands what happens to stop something like this happening again?
I think it's critical. I think that this is absolutely one of the key events in the course of this political cycle. And I think that people are demanding, and rightly so, demanding answers about what happened here and how did we get in this place. But let's not forget that at the same time, the FBI and the Secret Service and all of their law enforcement and intelligence partners are struggling to continue to protect the former president, the current president, the current vice president, now candidate for the presidency. So there is the very tough reality of the demands of understanding that threat picture and taking appropriate proactive measures to protect these folks is only going to increase as we get closer to Election Day, and possibly even after Election Day, as we saw on January 6, 2020.
I know there's no love lost between yourself and Donald Trump. I mean, this is a man who accused you of treason.
Yeah, that wasn't good. But he is a former president and a candidate for office, and his ability to run a fair and vigorous campaign and to speak both to his supporters and his detractors is absolutely essential to the democratic process in this country. So no matter how you feel about Donald Trump or Joe Biden or Kamala Harris or any of them, if you're an American and you are committed to the ideals of this country and the democracy that we all treasure, I hope, then you have to be really concerned about our ability to protect the safety of all of these political figures, not just the ones you like or the ones that are on your team or the other team. That's not what this is about. I am first and foremost a former law enforcement officer, an attorney. I feel very strongly about the rule of law and the fairness and safety that adherence to the rule of law provides us in the United States of America. And Donald Trump is entitled to that in the same way that every other American is.
Just finally, what do you make of the security changes announced in the wake of this attempt for the former president, for Kamala Harris, as they continue to campaign?
I think they took good steps in the immediate aftermath to kind of put outdoor events on hold until they developed a better understanding about what they did wrong in Butler. And it appears that they are kind of coming out of that period now, and that The Trump campaign is going to resume having outdoor events. And we know that one of the steps that they've decided to take is to provide the ballistic glass that will shield him from any sort of attack like this in the future. That comes at an incredible cost and commitment of resources.
Yeah.
That stuff is very hard to move. It's hard to deploy and use accurately. The service relies on the United States military to transport that stuff and to set it up appropriately. So a lot of coordination there, a lot of high levels of approval to even have the military providing assistance to law enforcement is a little bit challenging in this country. So there's requests and approvals that you need to get in line before you can do that. But
would that be
all
unprecedented for candidates?
I've never seen it used before for candidates. So I think it's unprecedented. I can't claim to know the history of that perfectly.
Gosh, it says a lot about the moment, doesn't it?
It really does. And the fact that it is an entirely reasonable and good thing to do, right? We are operating in an incredibly dangerous time. The polarization and the kind of emotions around this election are at a peak. And let's not forget, we're a country in which pretty much anyone can get their hands on a very powerful military-grade weapon anytime they want. That makes this a powder keg.
The FBI does its investigation. How does it work then in terms of, I guess, responsibility? Does the Bureau say, these were the Secret Service failures? Or does the Bureau say, Butler SWAT team officer A and C really didn't do their job that day? I mean, what is the process from there?
So those kind of conclusions are really more in the lane of an inspector general. What the FBI will do is release a report detailing exactly what happened to the best of their ability to uncover that. And of course, shedding as much light as they can on the shooter himself and his background, motive, if they're ever able to determine that. The kind of circumstances of his life that they think may have had an influence on his desire to do this. And so what we should expect from the FBI is a report of the facts. It's really incumbent upon the service itself or their inspector general or Congress or all of those people in this case to take those facts and determine what needs to be done different the next time.
I know you specialize in the FBI getting into the minds of killers. Mm-hmm. Typically, what sort of a person, I know they're all different, typically what sort of a person takes this path to carry out an attempted assassination?
So it's really interesting. This incident, I think, is a bit unique. And again, what we know about motive and what brings a person to this point to undertake an act of political violence, we learn from their writings, from their communications, from their online searches, the record that they leave behind of what was in their head. In this case, we're not seeing a lot of very clear political leanings or a sort of terroristic purpose. This is absolutely an act of domestic terrorism, but there's not a lot of indicators of what he was thinking. So in many ways, Crooks, the shooter, looks almost more like the sort of personalities we encounter very commonly here in the United States in mass shootings. People young, alienated, disaffected, maybe depressed, people who show up at a school or a supermarket or a synagogue or really a hospital, anywhere you might find yourself in this country, and just start randomly killing people. That's what Crooks kind of feels like to me. But again, we'll have to see what the FBI concludes.